你能说一下你在6·4的经历吗？
不，我不能，我做不到。我实在不想谈论那件事情。
In 1989, the Chinese government's violent reaction to the revolutionary student-led movement at Tiananmen Square did more than suppress the protests. It entirely transformed the government. It marked a pivotal turning point that established an unprecedented system of authoritarian rule, with the massacre's immediate impacts evolving into long-term reforms centered on censorship, surveillance, and propaganda designed to control information. But to truly understand the significance of this tragedy and its lasting impact on modern history, we must first examine the revolution that started it. On April 15, 1989, former General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party Hu Yaobang passed away. This was a catalyst for the protests due to his reputation among the citizens.
So he had a very good reputation among intellectuals for helping the recovery after the Cultural Revolution, which was from 1966 to 76, and also for being sort of a liberalizer, wanting to open up Chinese politics. I think a lot of the outpouring around his death was because people felt he had been mistreated.
In the days following his death, thousands of people gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn him. This quickly evolved into political discussions, with students engaging in pro-democracy ideas that were rarely shared. With the influence of many figures such as student leaders Wang Dan, Chai Ling, and Wu Erkaisi, the discussion soon evolved into larger demonstrations. The government's response came soon after, with hardliners Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping publishing the April 26 editorial, condemning the demonstrations and labeling them as turmoil. Protesters viewed this as a direct attack, enraging them and heightening their efforts. By May, the protests had grown into a nationwide revolution, with hundreds of thousands of people from diverse backgrounds, including students, workers, and civilians, united under a shared desire for political reform.
The government suppress news, suppress the truth. Of course, we are struggling for democracy, for science, for law.
The square was bustling with activity, almost like a makeshift city, consisting of tents, banners, and students camping out for weeks. They also hung up posters, distributed leaflets, and devised slogans to promote their cause. These protests were revolutionary, as they threatened the government's unlimited control of expression, prompting the consideration of a forceful resolution. These ideas were ultimately halted, with reformist officials such as Zhao Ziyang advocating for peace, temporarily delaying the crackdown and jeopardizing his position. Finally, the students organized a hunger strike, which led Zhao to give a speech in an attempt to stop it, knowing its possible repercussions. However, he failed, with the strike escalating the protests to new heights. This was the tipping point for the government. Tensions were at an all-time high, and with the belief that the protests were becoming an increasing threat to its rule, it declared martial law on May 20th, marking the first sign of the government's pivot toward authoritarian rule. Troops began rolling into the square to end the protests. However, they were temporarily halted by citizens who formed barricades and pleaded with them. For a brief moment, it seemed that violence could be avoided. However, all hopes would soon be shattered. The government issued warnings to residents to stay away from the square. Yet, many protesters remained, believing they could again halt the soldiers' advance. On the night of June 3rd to 4th, for 8 unforgiving hours, central Beijing descended into chaos. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, and soldiers armed with live ammunition moved in from multiple directions. Residents tried to block the incoming troops, but the soldiers continued their advance, firing into the crowds. The atmosphere was thick with smoke, alongside the pungent scent of blood. However, despite the actions of the soldiers, the responsibility for the massacre was held primarily by the government.
This is a counter-revolutionary riot that's trying to overthrow a socialist system, that these are criminals. And that's the message that the soldiers are given. So I think that's why they're willing to shoot. Many didn't shoot.
Instead, soldiers were misled into believing they were putting down rioters and criminals, the central idea of the government's propaganda campaign following the massacre. It is estimated that hundreds, even thousands of unarmed civilians were killed by soldiers under the cold, unforgiving night sky, marking the brutal end of the protests. Not only did the massacre end the protests, but it also demonstrated the government's willingness to use force to maintain control, marking a further step in its shift to widespread control. The crackdown was not the end of suppression for citizens. Instead, it was merely the beginning. Following the massacre were a series of immediate effects that shaped China's future and fully cemented its authoritarian system. First was fear. Trials, arrests, and interrogations were broadcast nationwide, sending a clear message to all supporters of the protests. Next was censorship. The government utilized censorship to fire journalists sympathetic to the students, and all discussions, reports, and footage of the massacre were banned. Finally, propaganda reshaped the narrative. The government controlled the media while spreading patriotic posters praising the military, all to frame the protests as an overall detriment to the country's stability. Together, these measures did more than suppress the massacre. They marked a definitive shift from pro-democracy discussions to tightly controlled information, forming the foundation for China's modern authoritarian system. Internationally, the Chinese government faced immediate backlash. Many foreign countries condemned the massacre, canceled diplomatic visits, suspended military ties, imposed trade sanctions, and reduced financial assistance. Overall, the repercussions China faced from other countries were detrimental, damaging its relations and temporarily isolating it both economically and politically. In the long term, rather than encouraging reform, this isolation led to the prioritization of internal control over international approval. Finally, many political officials were purged following the Tiananmen Square massacre. Most prominent was former CCP Premier Zhao Ziyang, who was quickly purged and kept under house arrest for the remainder of his life due to his reformist ideals. Zhao's replacement, Jiang Zemin, soon succeeded Deng Xiaoping as leader of the Chinese Communist Party. These purges, alongside Deng's succession, promptly ended all discussions of democratic reform, paving the way for further control. The immediate impacts of the massacre soon evolved, setting the stage for long-term changes that continue to shape China today. Some historians argued that the Tiananmen Square massacre was not a decisive turning point, claiming that China was already authoritarian due to its one-party system, as well as other repressive measures before Tiananmen. However, China in the late 80s is incomparable to China in the modern day. Reformist officials advocated for democratic reforms, and the government tolerated dissent to a degree incomprehensible today, demonstrating that at the time it didn't have absolute control. But after Tiananmen, that changed. What began as immediate repression in the aftermath of the massacre soon evolved into an unprecedented nationwide system of censorship. Today, the government censors not only the massacre, but also other sensitive pieces of information, most notably through the Great Firewall. Initiated in 1998 and managed by the Chinese government's Ministry of Public Security, it monitors, restricts, and controls the flow of information on the internet, leaving millions of young Chinese citizens oblivious to the massacre that occurred in the heart of Beijing. Because of these efforts, alongside punishments for discussing it in public, the massacre has become a taboo. Those who carry its memories are forced to share their stories privately, creating silent dissidents who fear speaking out, revealing the nature of China's authoritarian system and its lasting effect on citizens. The authoritarian system cemented by the Tiananmen crackdown is also evident in how the government deals with protests today. In 2013, authorities in Chengdu prevented a protest before it began, altering the calendar and stationing countless police officers. Unlike the Tiananmen protests, when hesitation allowed for weeks of protests, dissent is now immediately suppressed, reflecting a complete shift to repression. The significance of the student-led protests in Tiananmen Square lies not only in the lives lost, but also in the precedents set afterward. What began as a violent crackdown marked a decisive moment, solidifying the authoritarian system that defines and continues to shape modern-day China's social sphere. In the decades since, millions remain silenced, and the massacre has been effectively erased from public memory, leaving only a fragile awareness of what occurred, demonstrating the lasting legacy of Tiananmen and how it continues to reshape society today.